Welcome to part 2 of our topic, place and non-place. There's quite a bit of definitional work to get through at the beginning. So, theorists of space and place usually draw a distinction between the two. So you'll often see us refer to a space, and you'll often hear people talk about a place. And although the distinction is quite firm in a lot of the literature, it can collapse in everyday life, but just bear with us for the moment. So generally the idea is that space is rootless and shaped by external forces. It's the grid that's planned, the buildings that are designed, the location and distance between certain things. And that's seen as very lifeless and just material. Whereas place is rooted rather than rootless and shaped through human agency. So shaped by what people do and what they make of a space. And it's produced and reproduced a social and moral meaning. It's a very, very powerful and emotive concept that's used pretty much in all the humanities and social science disciplines, but also very, very, very common in everyday life. And so we're just trying to get across the kind of everyday uses and meanings. It can be private. Your bedroom can be a place to you. It has meaning to you, but to others it might just be a space on a floor plan. It can be public. Or it can be a mixture. And in a week on consumption and consumer spaces, there's this weird mix, right? They have some meaning for some people, but they're obviously cynically created for a particular purpose. So even a public space might evoke feelings of place for some and not others. It's very valuable to communities, but the boundaries of those communities are not always clear. Place has a complex relationship to capitalism. So it seemingly counters capitalism at certain times as a refuge from consumerism, a place of meaning, a place of community, a place where you know other people, etc., etc., etc. And focusing on relationships rather than consumption. But even the very idea of community is very much commoditized in capitalism. Again, you think about the billboard picture you can see there of when Honeysuckle was being redeveloped, where friends happen. So trying to sell place, sell relationships, sell community as part of the redevelopment, as part of the real estate value. So place is used to sell products and brand suburbs, cities, towns, and consumers' places, such as new developments in particular. And back to malls, which we discussed in the previous part, are really important social spaces for seeing how these boundaries get blurred.
And something like a mall is like a liminal thing between private and public, I suppose, in terms of who's interpreting. And I think most of the people that go there as consumers would think of it as a public space. The owners, not so much.
Yes.
So there's a kind of play-off here of interpretation, and I think that's an important thing of how people relate to spaces and places is contextual to who they are and what their purposes are. And
it's such a great point. Put a pin on a map. For some people, where that pin is has a strong sense of place. For others, it's a series of issues or problems or potential value or potential capital accumulation. So Doreen Massey, who's a really influential writer on place, who really began in sort of human and cultural geography, but whose work is sort of transcended, says the specificity of place derives from the fact that each place is the focus of a distinct mixture of wider and more social relations, and further again, that the juxtapositions of these relations may produce effects that would not have happened otherwise. Two crucial things there. One is this idea of mixture, that things come from near and far to make a place. It doesn't have to be ultra-localized. Things do come from near and far. They move and they change. But there is a sense that these things only really happen in this way in this place, as different from other areas, other neighborhoods, other cities. Depending on how you want to scale out, you can always make those juxtapositions. So I wonder whether this closes the door on consumer spaces as place, because we would say, oh, but they're so homogenized, they're so similar everywhere. I'm not convinced that you can close the door on that, because I think people do make their own relationships. I think the mixtures are important. But there is quite a tension in the literature about generic spaces of kind of capitalism and place as a kind of community counter to that.
I mean, if you go to a shopping mall to steal stuff, does that make it a space or a place under that analysis? So, I think you could probably say the same thing about a home. I mean, whether you consider it a space or a place probably is contingent upon the activities going on there and how you relate to them, I suppose. Yeah. So, I think I think consumer places are places.
I think so
as
too.
As much as spaces.
I think so too.
But I think what ends up happening is you render the things you don't like in them as the spatial and the things you do like in them as placial.
I think it's a really good way to put it. Yeah. Anything you don't like is, that's just space, it's meaningless.
Yeah.
And anything that matters to you has meaning and therefore needs to be defended.
Belonging in a place.
Yeah. Which takes us nicely to belonging. So, Friedman writes a lot about place. He's one of my favorite writers on place because he really brings it into the everyday. And so he argues that placemaking occurs when material space is inhabited and allows patterns and rhythms of life to develop. Now, patterns and rhythms are vague enough to not have to be over a set period of time with a set number of people in a certain way. But it's specific enough, this idea, there's some repetition. There's some repeated interaction, some repeated relationships, which is really important. Yeah. And for Friedman, there's agency in placemaking. It doesn't just happen. People work on it. It's part of what they do. 7 propositions. And again, they're really useful guides. So if you're ever confused about what is and isn't place, I always like Friedman as a place to go back to. So Friedman says, placemaking is a social process characterized by contestation. So it has to be made, and there'll be resistance to making it or challenges to making it. It's not granted, but made through social practices, which often involve competing claims over material space. Once created, places are not fixed, but subject to continued contestation. Good example, if you go past, say, an old bowling club. It's no longer used as a bowling club. There's quite a few around as suburbs change, as the people in them change, for example. That was probably a very meaningful place to a lot of people at one point in time. But it lost its battle with either aging population, change in the kind of work people do, a lot of people leaving the area, the land being coveted for other development. So there's a continual contestations. Places are made and they dissolve. They're made and they're dissolved. Secondly, the habitation of material space leads to patterns of everyday life, set on places of encounter where rituals of life are performed. Parks, markets, churches, malls, restaurants, houses. The key point here is patterns of everyday life through habitation, by being in them. One of the things that I think was quite challenging around a lot of the shifts towards technology and technology and platform capitalism as a kind of consumption was there was a worry that, well, what happens if people stop moving around to consume? Do places get hollowed out of meaning and pattern and ritual? If you no longer have to walk up your street to get coffee or buy milk, and you no longer pass people and talk to them, if everything just gets delivered to your door, does the fabric of place begin to break down? Obviously, it's going to vary a lot, but it is an important question, I think, when we think of the everydayness of place. Places are impermanent and undergo changes over time. I think that's straightforward. The rituals of everyday life, number 4, offer a sense of security and stability. So when you move away, when you go and live somewhere else, when you go study somewhere else, one of the first things you often notice is that you lose a sense of security and stability and assuredness about place. Yeah. Even if you didn't engage with it wholeheartedly, even if you wanted to leave it, there was a sense of security and stability when you have a sense of
when you
place.
start to feel like a fish out of water kind of thing.
Exactly. You feel out of place. In place, out of place. 5, the autonomy of place is illusory and subject to regulation, for instance, by property owners, authorities, donors, people who say what can and can't happen somewhere. And this is quite shocking in a sense, because there's all these first 4 points about how people make it and it's all in the agency of humans, and then Friedman hits us with, but that's just an illusion, right? Because the council, the local government, they can demolish an area, they can demolish a neighbourhood, they can approve a big development, you can have something that gets built in the area where you used to walk, a park can be closed down, etc., etc., etc. So because if you go back to Massey, places are assembled from near and far things, there are lots of different actions that can stop or change or influence those. And regulation affects different members of the community in different ways. So while contestation is common, solidarity cannot always be assumed when place is under threat. And so when you see a lot of kind of community action and activism around threats to place, that's where that really comes into play. The importance of the village and neighbourhood places can diminish over time as social and economic networks widen. Never met my neighbours, I don't understand this place. I used to know everyone in the street, now I don't. There's a duplex where my backyard used to be. All kinds of things that change and rupture. So that everydayness is really, really important. And we go back to our question, do malls have these things? I think is an important question.
I think like something like the Supercars event in Newcastle, all those 7 points kind of show are brought out in the debates that happened over whether that should have happened in that space or not. Who does it benefit? Who does it doesn't? Poor residents that all of a sudden have their like area blocked off for like 3 months and have cars rumbling past and shaking their old buildings, so bits of brick are falling off, to like the thousands of punters that want to come on and enjoy that space. I think there's the things there that are going on in something like a debate over that, and also speak to that place and space stuff as well.
And constantly challenged and contested, but a lot of out of people's control, because the donors, the backers, the boosters, the authorities, the owners, and the idea of selling the whole city and putting it on the map, and how that then affects notions of place and who benefits. A great example. Okay. So crucial in all of this, as you can imagine, is if places where everyday patterns and rituals are performed, it's a place where we feel a sense of belonging. However, the flip side of belonging is exclusion. And exclusion can work in lots of different ways. You can say, well, those people aren't from this place. I don't know who they are. I'm suspicious of what they're doing, etc., etc., etc. Or you welcome people into your place and try to get them used to the rhythms, patterns, and rituals, etc. But there's all kinds of smaller everyday activities that help show this idea of belonging and exclusion. So think of these common everyday phrases. And Tim Cresswell, who's written a lot about place as a concept and in different disciplines, talks about being in and out of place. And not just individuals being in and out of place, but different behaviors and actions that are in and out of place. So think of the idea, I feel out of place when I go to a black tie event, right? I feel out of place when the supercars are in town. Whatever it is, there's all kinds of different ways in which people may feel out of place. It's a common everyday feeling. But if you dig down into a little bit, well, why do you have that feeling? Because the familiarity's gone, or the patterns and the rituals are gone, or your sense of belonging has been disturbed. Know your place. When people say know your place, they mean what you're doing is out of place. You shouldn't be saying that. You shouldn't be speaking up about this AFL player. You should know your place. Just kick the ball, etc., etc. It's often the thing that parents say to children, actually. Know your place, keep quiet, etc., 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 because you're being excluded from something, or you're being expected to behave in a particular way. Not in this place. It's fine if you want to build an aluminium smelter in the outer suburbs, but not in this place. So there's this idea of, well, certain things belong here, but certain things don't.
Not in my backyard.
Not in my backyard. You don't belong here in this place. And so then there's often the direct idea about who belongs and who doesn't, and what brings on that sense of belonging. If neighbours move in, blast loud music, have constant parties, you might find other people in the neighbourhood going, this sort of thing doesn't belong in this place. This kind of behaviour doesn't belong here. So they're immediately drawing a boundary of belonging and exclusion, right? But then also think of that feeling about when you've been out of place and you come back, and that feeling of like, oh, this is back where I belong. This is my place. This is where I feel comfortable, and I know people, and I can dress how I want and act how I want and do what I want. So belonging and exclusion have really everyday elements, and then these everyday elements often kind of come down on other intersections like race, ethnicity, gender, religion, sexualities, disabilities, age, for example. There are all kinds of things. I mean, if a whole lot of elderly people show up to like a punk show, people would be like, oh, they're a bit out of place. What are they doing, right? So there's really kind of harmless ways in which it happens. But then people of an ethnic or racial minority move into a neighborhood and people get up in arms. What are they going to do next? Are they going to start, are they going to build a mosque down on the corner, etc.? Houses of worship are often huge triggers for what is and isn't out of place in different places.
2 90-year-olds making out on the bump-proof bench would be weird. 2 16-year-olds, not so much.
Such a good example. Which brings us to behaviours, gestures, language, accent, roots and lineage. You're not from this neighbourhood, not from this city. Activities. So solicitation can happen in some places and not in others, right? Or it's sort of allowed in places or tolerated and not in others. Even within, say, Newcastle. Peddling, selling stuff illegally on the side of the street. Kind of tolerated in some places, cracked down in others. Scavenging, right? Going through people's bins and garbage, looking for recycling and cans that can be recycled. Happens in some neighbourhoods, it's frowned upon in others, stopped in some, allowed in others. Even clothing, and not even just, gang colours not being allowed in pubs, but where you can and can't go in shorts or thongs, etc. These are all belonging and exclusion gestures around certain feelings or meanings of place. You can't drink that here, you can't sell that here, etc. Alcohol-free zones denote, in this place you can't do that, but you can do it over there, etc., etc., etc. So, these feelings are often generated or closely entangled with what we consume and the familiarity it brings. So, for example, McDonald's in Pakistan is out of place. It's strange food. It does exist, but it's strange food for elite clientele. It feels out of place. You can't wear that to the shops in the junction. Yeah, you probably can't rock up with thongs and a singlet or no shirt to the shops in the junction and be expected to be treated with respect and dignity and served. So consumption does play a role in this, and consumption can be exposed in this. But for Cresswell, coming back, exclusion is always being transgressed. People are always crossing the lines to various consequences. They're always doing things that are out of place and seeing what might happen and seeing what the consequences might be, or taking the risk to do something out of place. And that transgression becomes a really important everyday act. All right, we'll move on to the non-place.
Yeah, okay, so this has been a kind of concept to think about homogenized places that feel the same no matter where they are in the world. It's a way of thinking about globalization. It's a way of thinking about how there's kind of infrastructural nodes that we kind of all experience in some way or another, particularly if you travel, that feel like they're dead, or feel like there's nothing going on there other than kind of waiting or dwelling or kind of moving from one place to another. They're kind of these liminal places. So where a place is kind of has relational, historical things going on with identity, non-places are kind of pointed out where that stuff isn't important or doesn't exist. So airports tend to be the kind of often the key thing that are used to kind of show this, but also shopping malls, prisons in some ways, even like some people talk about them as, underneath freeways and all that kind of stuff, like dead stones that are kind of the same in many ways all around the world. Now, as we'll point out, there's often things going on in those places that move beyond this, but they're kind of a place also that time seems to disappear.
Could be anywhere, could be any time. I think that's the idea.
Yeah. You kind of know exactly what these places are going to be like before you go in them. There's not a lot of fun going on in these places normally. They're normally for specific purposes. They're kind of, you're made anonymous in these spaces, even though you often kind of got to use ID and you're dealing with security and stuff like that. But then there's not a lot of sociality going on in these places. It's a perpetual present, I think, of waiting to go from one place to the next. So, malls are seen like this in regard as being some kind of cultural vacuum in some kind of critical perspectives. But I think malls aren't non-places in many ways. The airport to me feels like a non-place, but then there's lots of interesting research that goes on about all the interesting stuff that goes on in airports as well. So this is a kind of overarching critical theory to think about how global capitalism is kind of needs these places to things to function. We need to kind of pass through them. Hotels are a good example. The Radisson or the fancy hotel looks the same pretty much all around the world. Motorway service stations, supermarkets, holiday inns.
Holiday inns are always the same, and that's all academics can afford. Okay, so it's like you just don't know which one am I in, where am I at?
Yeah, that's right. So, and for the subjectivity of this, it puts the kind of the consumer or the person in these spaces is kind of feeling empty, feeling bored, feeling fidgety, feeling that we need to get out of this space to actually live my life again, because life seems to stop in these places.
And they're rarely remembered. It's hard to remember definitively what does that airport look like compared to that one, that lobby compared to that one, that tunnel compared to that one. So airports are in the readings, in the Adey reading, and so airports have been defined as sort of blank spaces, devoid of excitement and interest, abstract, boring, placeless, perhaps non-places. And when you compare them to vibrant places, you can see why. So there is something in the non-place idea. However, Adey argues the contrary. Adey argues that movements, feelings, and emotions found in airports should not be subtracted from the powerful forces that permeate the airport terminals. Not just that stuff goes on, but they're places of deep emotion, anxiety, stress, love, care, etc. Adey argues these feelings, motions, and emotions are predicated by the form of airport control. They're stressful places. Bodies, as physical things and emotional things, are opened up to power at every turn, every check, every moment you don't know, am I going to be made to be late? Am I going to be made to be searched? Am I going to be made to stand over there? Is my plan going to be disrupted for me or the person I'm with, etc., etc., etc. So the paper's great because it seeks to examine how the affective expression, so it's sort of the feelings of hope, fear, joy, sadness, and many others, as well as the constitutive mundane bodily functions that occupy the airport terminal, may not be as distant from power and control as we think. They may be quite place-like in a sense, but they're not really places we covet and we desire. Yeah. So it's a kind of really in-between way of thinking about it. But I like the fact that Adey sort of argues that these kind of the triggers that are designed as part of the space bring out these emotions in different ways, but not in like a limitless range of different ways. There are certain emotional responses that these bring out. They excite bodily and emotional dispositions at an unconscious and pre-cognitive register, which is why I think they're so exhausting. And a lot of people have this feeling, I don't mind flying, but I can't stand airports. It's a really common
Yeah, interesting, the emotional thing there. I mean, other than maybe the anticipation and joy of, say, going on a holiday when you get to the airport, most of the emotions you experience in an airport are not ones you want to experience. They're anxiety and fear and boredom and listlessness.
Unless it's arrival. And you're waiting for someone you miss or you love or you care about, then there's emotion there. But
not so much goodbyes.
Not so much goodbye. There's different kind of emotion. So I think it's interesting. I just like it because it's provocative. I'm not sure I go all the way, but I like the provocation.
Yeah.
Okay, we'll end with our final slide on this. Is that this idea of non-place I think is interesting. I think the juxtaposition is useful because it helps us think about place a little bit more. And what place might be when we think about where it's absent. So I think that's quite important.
Foil. It's like a foil to think about what place means.
Yeah, I like that. I think a foil. But obviously it has its limits. So we take the most common examples, the mall, the call centre, the casino, the airport, all of which have been written out in literature. They can evoke a sense of place for some. And I think it's particularly important to think about the people who work in these places. Which is millions of people, and for them these places can have quite a different meaning. It's where they might have met their partner. It's where they might be proud to work and go every day, where they experience emotion, stress, all the kind of things that go along with life, where they have rhythms and ritual and belonging, etc.
Just saying that then is something I've always realised. I've only thought about airports as places to go to, never as places where people work. And
for some people, it's a big thing. It's a big step up in life, and so they can be positive. And we return again to this idea. Things are uneven and things are contextual, but not unimaginable. The image you see there is from fieldwork I did with call center workers in India who'd migrated from the frontier. You'll see it's quite a poorly written sign, but it's for international BPO UK and US. So it's for people who'll be making calls to the UK and US. They have to be really good English speakers. Has the salary information there, and it says required for, and someone has written by hand, Northeast people. So clearly they want people from this particular region who are known for their English language skills because they're not raised as Hindi speakers, they don't have strong accents, they're mostly Christians with sort of Pentecostal and Baptist upbringing, so they're quite good at American accents and the mimicry that's involved. And why I raise that here is that when I did a lot of research with call center workers who left areas of conflict, some also worked in the malls, etc., 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 they were often really proud to work in these places. That was a big step up. They could send money home. They were really important. So while to me these seem like the most dreary and awful places to work in, I used to work in both a call center and a shopping mall, I'd relate these experiences to them. And I just remember this one guy saying to me, all I have to do every day is tell people not to stand on that when they're taking a photo. And I get paid, and I get to stay inside, out of the rain, out of the dust, out of the wind, out of the extreme heat, and send money home. What could be wrong with that?
Yeah. Okay, we'll leave this section here and we'll come back in the third section this week to talk about a world without billboards.